The agenda this week considered the challenge of de-radicalization, questioned whether the language of left-right politics still adds up, heard the case for Northern Ontario to separate, and got a lesson on former Prime Minister Lester Pearson. Our week in review begins with the simmering battle between the province and its 42,000 doctors. At the general membership meeting at the Exhibition Place in Toronto over the summer, you talked about the fact that you basically went without salary for 3 months, right? At one point? What's the story there? What happened?
So it goes back to the cuts over 2015. So as you mentioned already, physicians faced unilateral cuts by the government that were imposed on them, averaging between 7 and 30%. In 2015, my youngest baby was born, so I was on mat leave. I had saved up for it. I'd worked extra hard just before my mat leave to save up for covering myself over mat leave. Once I came back from mat leave and started work again, I found that even though I was working equally hard, I still wasn't making as much. That 7% cut is huge. That 30% cut, it's huge. And at the end of the year, I was looking at a 30% drop in my income. So I did go about 3 months without paying myself, just living off my savings and my credit card and my line of credit, just to keep my own clinic going. And this is playing out.
But you did keep the clinic going.
I did keep my clinic going.
And you kept paying your staff.
I did.
And seeing patients.
I did. And that was the hard reality that my husband and my tiny family had to face. But this is playing out among physicians across Ontario and has been playing out since January 2015. Some physicians have even had to close their clinics because they just couldn't make do. Dr.
Resnick, does this sound like an anomalous situation to you, or is there more of this going on than we know?
Well, obviously I know our community here at Queen's best, and certainly I haven't seen what Dr. Allen has just described happening here at Queen's. I would point out that if this agreement were to have been accepted, it would end the unilateral cuts, which I agree with Dr. Allen were unwise and unwarranted. But we'll also see an infusion of approximately $1 billion to the physician compensation budget over the next few years if this agreement were to be agreed to. Look, we live in a publicly funded health system, and you know, right now we're spending 11% of our GDP on healthcare, and we're performing, you know, if we compare ourselves to other countries, 10th out of 11th in a recent Commonwealth health report. So there's lots of room for improvement. Look, the hospitals have been under tremendous pressure, it being the largest single cost in the system, and they've made great strides in becoming more efficient. I think we can also find ways to deliver excellent care to our patients at a cost that we can all afford.
Dr. Gandy, let me raise with you, what do we want to call it here, the dirty little secret of Ontario's healthcare system, which is there are too many patients seeking unnecessary care, demanding second and third and fourth opinions and extra tests that turn out to be not necessary. There's a lot of money blown in the healthcare system. Isn't that fair to say? And if the government wants to sort of bring you on side to help co-manage that excessive and inappropriate use, isn't that okay?
Steve, actually, the inappropriate and excessive use of healthcare is not so much what you're describing, because there is a small segment of patients who do ask for certain tests that are inappropriate. In my practice, it's not a big amount, quite frankly. I've seen some of it, but I've not seen a lot of it.
Tell me about your practice again. You're in Stayner.
I'm in Stayner.
You and how many other docs?
We have 5 doctors in Stayner.
And how many patients roughly among all of you?
So probably about 7,000.
7,000 patients?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've not actually seen very much of that. The inappropriateness of the healthcare system lies solely in the overwhelmingly bureaucratic mess that's in. We have far too many bureaucrats. We have, and this is true, we have 2 times as many healthcare bureaucrats per capita as Japan, 3 times as many per capita as Sweden, 4 times as many per capita as Australia.
Why do you think?
Why do I think?
Yeah, why is that the case?
Because bureaucracy is self-perpetuating, right? And every time that the government says, oh, we've got an issue we need to deal with, instead of dealing with frontline doctors and talking to frontline doctors about how to help it, they create another committee or another agency to deal with that issue. And that's where the real waste, that's the dirty little secret of the Ontario healthcare system.
Dr. Gordon, you've run a
Well,
big...
having been one of those dirty little secret bearers, I disagree with you. I think that we have, as a profession, denigrated those who do the administration. I remember when I started doing it, people said, how could you do that? It's like selling yourself out. Of all the things I've done in my career, the most challenging, the hardest was being an administrator. Because big decisions were made that affected thousands of people as opposed to the one person at a time. So I don't look at that as a particular dirty little secret, and whether we're better or worse than other countries, you can do a lot of comparisons.
No, I said the dirty little secret was the fact that there are inappropriate tests being given.
Yeah, so that part, I think that's a smaller part of the issue than we like to do. And when you do studies on it, you actually find that it isn't that much. They did a big one, I think it was in Kingston, looking at upper respiratory tract infections and visits to emerge. And they found that actually those who actually went in usually had something more than their cold, and that's why they went in, because the usual things weren't working. So I don't think that's a big cost to the system. How we as stewards of the system, the doctors, use the resources is very hard to understand, and that requires really good studies, because when you do find something, that's changeable.
What does this whole case say about the state of Canada's anti-terrorism efforts?
I think it says a lot of good things about the state of anti-terrorism in Canada, I think, because unlike some of the individuals we've had in Europe who've launched all kinds of attacks over the last couple of months, Aaron Driver was already known to law enforcement, partly through his own efforts of being very vocally pro-ISIS, unapologetically pro-ISIS online. And so he was monitored for quite a while. He was on a peace bond.
You want to just explain what that is?
So a peace bond is a kind of restriction on an individual's behavior, which for Aaron Driver was one of the heftiest we've seen in a while. So he wasn't allowed to have a Twitter account, a Facebook page. He was on a GPS monitor. He had a curfew. He wasn't allowed to own a laptop. His cell phone had to be given to him by the RCMP, and on and on and on. And so he was restricted in his behavior, was well known to law enforcement.
And well known to you.
And well known to me.
You knew him.
We knew him because we were called, so he was online for quite a while, and we were in touch then, and we were called by his lawyers to come and basically answer the unanswerable question of, is this guy a threat to Canada, as part of his peace bond trial. And so we sat down with him for about 3 hours.
When's the last time you spoke to him?
I spoke to him last in April of this year, 3 months before the attack.
Did he seem to you to be the kind of a guy who represented a threat to people in this country?
No. So in our dealings with him, I mean, this is the difficult question of the difference between someone who holds radical views and someone who acts on those views. And the debate is whether that's a kind of conveyor belt. Anyone who holds a radical belief will eventually act on those beliefs, and therefore everyone who holds certain beliefs should be monitored and watched, which is fundamentally impossible. Or, as the research suggests, are they actually two different kinds of people, right? Are people who talk are very different than people who do things. And therefore, you can monitor the people who do things by looking at who they're talking to, the kinds of activities they're involved in.
All right, so when you heard that he had planned to create some havoc, and that he was in fact killed in the process of trying to wreak that havoc, what went through your head?
I was very curious about the last few months, and so I spoke to him in April, and he basically said, I'm working now, I have a good group of friends, things are going well, and how are you doing, and what's going on with your life and your family, and so on. And this was April. And so my question is, what happened in May, June, and July? And one of the main things that happened that kind of supports the video that you just showed is that the call came from ISIS Central for more attacks against the West. And this video that you just saw is basically what's known as an oath of allegiance video of him giving an oath of allegiance to Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. And so something clicked or something snapped in between May, June, and July that set him on a different kind of trajectory, I think. And I think seeing those attacks in France and other places may have kind of influenced him to do something that was different. Again, there's no real evidence of what happened, but I mean, this is my kind of speculation based on the contents of the video, which are very reflective of all of the other videos that we've seen in the last year.
Let me ask Michelle about that video. When you look at him making that statement, do you take it seriously?
Again, that's the difficult question. All the points that Amar raised, how do you know? He didn't think he was a threat. He spent time with him. Sometimes you look at these videos and they're kind of laughable. I mean, they're ridiculous. And you think, you know, this guy certainly can't be a threat. But as Amar mentioned, there is sort of a pattern to those who then plan attacks, this Pledge of Allegiance. And so you can't ignore it.
Do you know what he
either.
planned to do?
Do we know what he planned to do?
Does anybody have any sense of
No,
what
I
he
mean,
planned to do?
there's actually still a lot of questions about that case. The one that's troubling for me is why it took a tip supposedly from the FBI to alert Canadians to this. So I think there'll still be some questions that hopefully will get answered.
Meaning our authorities should have been on top of this and should not have to have been tipped off by foreign authorities.
Well, we know that they were not monitoring him, and I think that there are a number of people, they say they have a list that's huge, and how do you know who is actually at a risk? So whatever their calculation is, he was pushed further down. But you would think there would be some sort of electronic monitoring that should pick up something. And I haven't really heard answers to those questions yet.
Having said that, should we be pleased that the two security services from two different countries appear to have worked well together in order to prevent something truly disastrous from happening?
Sure, absolutely. In this case, it shows that this is a success in that matter. I also, though, would caution that sometimes we've run into trouble with this type of cooperation. And, you know, the Meher case wasn't that long ago, and that's why there were certain, they call them MOUs, Memorandums of Understanding, put in place, and certain provisions about sharing information. So it's sometimes a catch-22.
Meaning people who turn out to be innocent can be taken away, virtually kidnapped, and renditioned off to all sorts of awful things happening to them.
I mean, that was that case, and there was...
That was the Meher case.
Right.
Okay, let me get you in here, Jamil. You've been away for the last 6 months. We talked to you when you were overseas, actually,
Yeah,
in
we
Belgium.
did while I was in Molenbeek, yeah.
Yes, okay. So let's just go through the list. Where were you visiting while you were overseas?
I spent time in Europe, so I was in France and Belgium and some other European countries, and I went to Egypt and Kenya and South Korea and Australia.
And what was the point of the trip?
Well, initially it was, I think the Aaron Driver case may have this effect on some people too, where after the Paris attacks, I kind of had this breakthrough moment where I started to see how things that happen in Western countries and our own policies and our own cultural forces put young people in positions of vulnerability to these kinds of ideas. And when I saw who organized the Paris attacks, and I saw like they grew up in the same kind of neighborhood as me, they grew up listening to the same music, having the same kind of, fantasies about being a gangster one day. And I said, maybe there's something that we could learn about what's happening in our own countries. And so that's why I initially went to Europe. And I kind of chased what I learned there and found my way to different countries as I went. It wasn't a very well-planned trip when I initially left Toronto.
But clearly the experiences that you shared with the people who we're focusing on in this program, at some point you either grew out of it or realized that you were not going to be affiliated with that lifestyle.
Yeah.
They didn't get that message. Why do you think?
Yeah, well, I think like the big breakthrough that I had, I think, which is kind of separating this issue from the identity politics, where we can actually talk about it without getting kind of too focused on particular communities, or this ideas kind of transcend identity in some ways. And Aaron Driver is an example of that. His background is very different from, I think, how people stereotypically think about who's vulnerable to these ideas. So I think that's a big part of it, is like seeing like what is happening locally that puts young people in a position where they start to think that these ideas make sense. And in a lot of neighborhoods in Toronto, we have youth organizations that work with young people who are on the verge of believing self-destructive and destructive things, and they help pull young people back into a place of positivity. And I think the response that most countries that I travel to and most countries I read about have to radicalization is not to start with people who know how to do that. Not to say who in my city already knows how to work with young people and bring them to a place of positivity. The starting point is to say, well, we need to build a whole new set of knowledge and a whole new set of experiences on how to deal with these particular young people. And that's, I think, the identity politics at play. It's us saying some young people are different than others. And I think in a country like this and a city like ours, we've proven that that's not the case, that young people have common challenges, and where their parents come from or who they pray to is not central to how they're going to experience life.
A spokesperson for CSIS had this to say about all of this. Right-wing extremist circles appear to be fragmented and primarily pose a threat to public order and not to national security. Tell me about that distinction, not to public order or excuse me, a threat to public order, but not to national security. What's the difference?
Yeah, and that's something I hear quite often when I'm interviewing law enforcement and intelligence is, why are we not paying attention to this? And that's a very common refrain. And so, yeah, there is a tendency to describe the acts of right-wing extremists as simply criminal events, threats to public order, as reflection of individual pathology rather than cultural pathology, as we tend to do with Islamic-inspired violence. And so I think the problem with that is that it doesn't recognize that threats to disparate communities across the country on a regular basis are also threats to our national sense of well-being in terms of being direct threats to our constitutional values. And how is that not extremist? Even in the case of Justin Bork, who shot, as we know, in Moncton, 3 RCMP officers, that was not characterized as terrorism. There was one headline. I absolutely would. Yeah, using those same definitions. There was even a headline that said, yes, he terrorized a community, but he was not a terrorist. But he was motivated by, ideological, some of those same threads that I talked about earlier on. Anti-statism, pro-gun rights, which is unusual in the Canadian context, but that was him. And, some of these more traditional right-wing ideologies.
Back when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, there were 3 people arrested into an alleged plot to open fire at a mall in Halifax. And the Justice Minister at the time, who was Peter MacKay, called these alleged perpetrators murderous misfits. He says the attack does not appear to have been culturally motivated, therefore not linked to terrorism. What do you think about that characterization?
Yeah, I think it was an inapt characterization. It was quite clear, I think, after the fact that these youth were inspired by right-wing and white supremacist ideologies. They had some of the literature, the propaganda was on their websites and their website history. And so, yeah, clearly they were ideologically motivated. Again, sort of saw a mission to make a statement about the changing demographics and the changing policies in their part of the world, but also across Canada as well.
So that reflects a bit of a mindset that if it's not related to Islam, it's not terrorism, which you think we need to change. Do we not take right-wing extremism seriously enough in this country?
I don't think we do, and I think we don't really recognize the extent of the threat. So for the report that I've shared with you, from 1980 to about mid-2015, we identified over 120 incidents associated with right-wing extremist individuals and groups. And just in 28, just in the last, since 2010, which is far more than the number of incidents associated with Islamic extremism. Yet, again, we're not counting that. Yeah.
If the idea at the end of the day is to terrorize, does it make a difference whether it's rooted in Islam or rooted in right-wing extremism?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the definition that I use for hate crime, which is what my work generally revolves around, is an act intended to intimidate individuals and communities, which is very much the same as sort of our federal definition of terrorism. They're very much parallel.
From Warsaw to Washington, the political divide that matters is less and less between left and right, and more between open and closed. Debates between tax-cutting conservatives and free-spending social democrats have not gone away, but issues that cross traditional party lines have grown more potent. Welcome immigrants or keep them out? Open up to foreign trade or protect domestic industries? Embrace cultural change or resist it? Let's get into this. Michael, they onto something here?
Yeah, I think they are. I think the decline of party has been something we've been seeing now for more than a generation. Assumptions about class voting patterns, arrogant, tends to be upper middle class people who assume a certain type of person will vote in a certain type of way. I mean, let's talk about Brexit. I suppose I have most experience of that. This is a colossal misreading by the establishment. I'm not going to call them the Chardonnay sipping establishment, but people in London, whether they were major party leaders or Benedict Cumberbatch or J.K. Rowling or even David Beckham, they all said we had to remain. And a lot of people outside of London, and London is a separate country, London is not Britain, they said, well, why?
London is Britain, but it's just a very different part of
London is a separate entity. London is so different. The pulse, the vibe, the pace of London is profoundly different from, and the wealth too, and the assumptions, and the cultural assumptions. A lot of the other towns, irrespective of the ethnicity of the people, by the way, it's illusory to think that it was only white working class people. A lot of people who are brown and black said, we don't want to be told what to think and how to feel any longer. To a degree, yes, globalization has passed us by, but that's not the only issue here. There was something visceral and something emotional. They simply believed that the country they had grown up with was changing radically. And here's an important point to make, because I've heard a lot of people say, well, it was racism. In a way, it may have been, but it wasn't racism against people from the former British Empire or Commonwealth. It was people from Poland and Romania, good, fine people, but were coming into Britain and transforming the nature and the employment force of the country.
Adrian, let me get you to weigh in on this. Left and right is too old, open and closed is where it's at now.
Well, I think left and right still exists. I mean, we have, in our country, we always see the major cities will vote liberal, and then the outside of the major city, urban areas will vote conservative. So we still have these divides. But if we're going on the premise of what Michael was just saying with respect to Brexit, and I agree with pretty much everything he said, this wasn't about necessarily left and right. So the economist refers it to bridges up, bridges down, and the like. I think pendulums always swing one way or the other, and then we see more and more people around the world on both sides of the political spectrum saying, I don't like what globalization has done. I don't like what these so-called open borders and free market has done. It's taken my job away. It's eroded my income. It's not affording my children an opportunity to have careers. So there is a bit of protectionism with it. We see it on, you mentioned with Donald Trump, you also see it with Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders pulled her so far to the left during the primaries, she had to denounce the Trans-Pacific Partnership. She had to start talking about these trade deals.
Or she'd have had a revolt on her hands.
Absolutely. So regardless of what side of the so-called political spectrum you're on, ultimately we all want to have our own future, secure our own goodwill moving forward. And I just think that it was completely misread by the so-called elites. And I will joke about them being the Chardonnay sipping ones.
You will, because you run the Sun, so you can do that. Omer, let me get your take on this. From your perch, does it feel like left and right is old and open and closed is a more relevant comparison these days?
Well, I think left and right was somewhat anachronistic the entire time we used it. You know, it's a divide that comes from the French Revolution based on who sat on the left and who sat on the right. Even during the Cold War and World War II, actually, you had members of the left and members of the right who didn't want to intervene in World War II, who wanted to keep the borders closed to Jews. And so there's this strain, I think, of nativism and of conservatism, of populism that runs through both the right and through the left. I would disagree with Michael somewhat and say that I think race was at the heart of Brexit as much as economic populism was. You know, if you look at the areas that voted leave, many of them had been economically depressed for a while. But if you look at, you know, the races and the ethnicities that voted that voted remain, something like 2/3 of British Asians, voted to remain. 70% of British Muslims voted to remain. An overwhelming majority of British Africans, blacks, voted to remain. And what we saw afterwards was a surge of hate crimes against minorities. And so I don't think it's really an answer to say that this kind of racism was directed against Poles and not against blacks or against Asians, because racism exists on a continuum. And if you look at what Nigel Farage was saying, the right-wing lunatic who heads the UKIP, if you look at the poster that he unveiled, if you look at the rhetoric that he used, you know, this is someone who defended the term chinky. This is someone who's used the N-word before. I mean, we have to get very serious about the racism in our society and the demagogues who have been exploiting it, whether it's Le Pen or Farage or Trump.
I know you're going to want a chance to get back at him on that, but stand by, because I want to hear from Rick for the first time. I want to hear from Rick. Go ahead, weigh in on this, Rick.
Well, I do think The Economist has kind of missed the mark here a little bit. I mean, I actually see a lot of continuity in what the left is advocating for around the world. You know, the left has always stood for diversity, has always stood for democracy, has been critical of free trade agreements because they're too enabling of corporate rights as opposed to citizen rights. I think what we've seen over the last few years is the conservative coalition coming apart in the United States, in Europe. So we now have three camps politically. We have the left, which you know, I take Michael's point, is unraveled a little bit in terms of regional politics in the UK, for instance. But we now have two competing conservative tendencies. We have the kind of Donald Trump populist right, which I fully agree. You have to say, is making an appeal to racism, is making an appeal to Islamophobia. And then we have the kind of traditional neoconservative right, in favor of tax cuts and fully in favor of free trade agreements, no matter the cost. So I think what we're seeing is really a war for the soul of conservatism around the world, and the left is largely continuing to perform its historical role.
Stan, it does kind of raise some questions about how much Ontario nationalism there really is. I mean, you talk to Quebecers and you talk to Albertans. Many of them are Quebecers first, Albertans first. You never hear that in the province of Ontario. Maybe sometimes in the north, though. They're Northerners first before they're Ontarians.
Absolutely, because Ontario tends to think of themselves as Canada, okay? And for much, except for the McGuinty Wynne era, for much of our history, we've been paying, sending equalization payments to other parts of the country, and so we just feel that that's part of our obligation. And of course, with the McGuinty Wynne era, we are now becoming a have-not province. Whereas in Northern Ontario, we've always felt we've always had our own resource culture. We tend to look at land differently than people in Southern Ontario. It's a broad brushstroke, but I take a look at Southern Ontario as more of an environmental culture, where they look at Northern Ontario as one big park for our benefit, a very colonial attitude. Whereas in Northern Ontario, we tend to look at the land is, okay, we have forestry and pulp and paper, it's a renewable resource, we plant trees, we have enormous geological resources, we dig mines, and we go up the value chain. Sudbury being a case where the expertise in mining is recognized globally.
Yeah, but the funny thing about this, Laura, let me bring you in on this. The funny thing about this is this issue seems to come up regardless of who's in power. I mean, Stan said it's been a factor during the McGuinty and Wynne era, fair enough. But, Mike Harris was from North Bay. He was premier from 1995 to 2002, and we heard rumblings of this then, too. Is there no mainline political party in the province today that can adequately represent the feelings of Northerners, in your view?
Well, it's a tall order. You have to understand the region very thoroughly. You have to understand the attitudes very thoroughly. And what you're looking at is a huge landmass, very few voters, and an economy that runs counter-cyclical to what's happening in Southern Ontario for at least as long as I've been here. So that the policies that are made to cover the province don't really fit, and it doesn't matter who's in power. And Mr. Daybell, who was the predecessor to Mr. Holloway with the previous party, I mean, he set up a tent at Queen's Park in the 70s, I think, to protest these very issues we've been discussing.
Quite right. Protested the Bill Davis government, and that didn't go anywhere either. I mean, Eric, in your reporting, do you get any sense that if another party were in power, these issues might be less dramatic than they are now?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the catalyst is for this time coming up. I know Mr. Halliday works for the Ontario Northland Transportation Commission, so that could be part of it, although the plans to divest that have sort of gone away. The train service hasn't returned. You mentioned Mike Harris being the premier. There was also a brief moment there where the leader of every party was from Northern Ontario, with Lynn McLeod and Howard Hampton. And so, like I said before, I don't think this sentiment is necessarily based on that. I think it's always going to be easy for Northerners to say they don't understand us, and that's why that's why this isn't working out, or that's why we don't get this thing that we would like here.
In which case, Dan, if separatism is unlikely to be in the cards, and if joining Manitoba is unlikely to be in the cards, what could be done to make people in Northern Ontario feel that their concerns were being more listened to by the people who make the decisions at Queen's Park?
First, for starters, a little bit more autonomy on land use up in Northern Ontario.
How do you do that? Municipality by municipality?
I don't have the magic formula for it, but I mean, what's happening right now is, let's take a look at the Ring of Fire. There's enormous frustration in Northern Ontario that it's taken so long. We haven't even, the discovery was made in 2007. We're supposed to get some feedback this fall, and we're hoping that the provincial government will set aside funds for an east-west road, which is 280 kilometers that will connect the 4 First Nations.
They've had $1 billion set aside in every budget for that road.
Absolutely.
So why isn't it happening?
Exactly. And it makes me think, is it in the scope of, well, if we build this road, the environmentalists in Southern Ontario will be upset, because there's the sense of the environmental vote will always be larger than the First Nations or Northern Ontario vote. And any party has to understand that. So is that what's slowing this down?
Laura, follow up on that if you would. How could Queen's Park give more power to Northern Ontario to be in charge of its own affairs?
The evil D word, devolution. So, in other words, provide regions with more decision-making power. Now, not everybody in Thunder Bay or Northwestern Ontario agrees that the health integration networks have worked well, but that would certainly be a starting point to think about ways of providing the opportunity for people up here to make decisions that fit this part of the world.
But if I can use an analogy, Eric, you know, if the Premier wants to allow the City of Toronto, for example, to have more power over its own affairs, she can do that. She passed, and remember that happened, they passed the City of Toronto Act, and Toronto got more powers. Because there's a government in Toronto, the city. There's no government of Northern Ontario. So how do you devolve power to the north in a same kind of a way to give Northerners a greater say over their destiny?
I don't know if there is an easy way to do it. I know that recently New Democrats from Timiskaming Cochrane, John Vantoff, suggested they have a Northern Ontario caucus where policy decisions, and I think at the time he was thinking specifically of the spring bear hunt, which has kind of been a flashpoint for this separatist sentiment, that this caucus would then decide the issues in the north. But I mean, you can't just have, I mean, for one, it's mostly opposition MPs, but you can't have 11 MPPs sort of overruling the moves of the government. I mean, how that would work in determining budgets and all that would be massively complicated.
Here's a photo of Pearson. This is him in his element. At this point, he is Canada's ambassador to the United States. He's at the San Francisco conference, which eventually established the United Nations. And here, Anthony, is how you describe how he worked his diplomatic magic. Here's a quote from the book. His weaving approaches were evident on the ice when he played for Oxford against Swiss teams in the 1920s. One fellow Oxonian and future Governor General, Roland Michener, remembered Pearson as a good stick handler who would swerve back and forth across the rink. He often started from defense position, so the Swiss in their sports columns called him Herr Zigzag, which was typical of his play. Diplomat Charles Ritchie observed with admiration that Pearson approached his objectives indirectly, not by method of head-on confrontations. He was incredibly persistent. He would back away from something and then come back to it, come around to it again. That's diplomacy there, isn't it?
That is diplomacy. That is Pearsonian diplomacy. And for Pearson, a lot of it was tactics. He was a superb improviser. He was not a dogmatic thinker, so it allowed him to escape positions or just abandon them while everyone else was still clinging to them and often lead the crowd to where the compromise was going to be. So that was him and his element.
In 1948, he eventually makes the decision to go into partisan politics. Becomes the MP for Algoma East, which includes Manitoulin Island, serves as Secretary of State for External Affairs. 1963, finally becomes Prime Minister. How much of those skills that he had as a diplomat were transferable to partisan politics?
It was a very, very difficult transition. He didn't have, he was sort of bad at all the things that really don't matter in the long run. He was terrible on the platform. He had a lisp. He had no public charisma. He was great at the things that do matter, like a deep sense of policy, a deep sense of purpose. He had a hard time saying no to people. And often people would take his zigzagging from position to be weakness. Because in politics, if you change your mind, you're weak.
You're a flip-flopper.
If you compromise, you're seen as weak. And he was a superb compromiser. And the flag is a great example of that. The flag we have is not his first design. A more rigid, dogmatic thinker would have clung to the first design, come hell or high water, and failed. And Pearson kept moving from design to design till we get the maple leaf.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety at tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, or on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.